The rain poured mercilessly from the heavens, drumming against the cobbled streets and rooftops of the kingdom like 1,000 urgent knocks. Thunder rumbled in the distance, shaking the very foundation of the palace walls. The night was cold, and the wind howled as though mourning some unseen tragedy. But none of these things compared to the storm raging in the heart of Prince Godwin. Drenched to his very bones, his tattered cloak clinging to his skin, he stood in the middle of an unfamiliar street, staring at the house before him. He had been to many homes that night, testing the hearts of those who claimed to love him. He had begged for food, pleaded for shelter, and each time he had been met with cruelty, indifference, or outright disgust. None of them knew who he was. None of them saw the prince beneath the rags. He had seen the truth, an ugly truth that made his heart ache. These women, these supposedly kind and beautiful ladies who filled the palace with their laughter and graces, who curtsied and lowered their eyes in feigned humility before him, had no compassion in their hearts. And now, standing before this house, the house of the one woman he had once believed he loved more than the rest, he felt a sinking dread deep in his gut. He wanted, more than anything, for her to be different. He took a deep breath, squared his shoulders, and limped forward, leaning on his wooden staff like a weary traveler. He knocked softly on the wooden door, listening as footsteps approached. The door creaked open slightly, and then, all at once, it swung wide. A young woman, with flawless skin and eyes sharp as daggers, stood before him. Even in the dim glow of the lanterns, she was breathtakingly beautiful. The prince had once imagined her as his queen, seated beside him on the golden throne, but the moment she saw him, her expression twisted with pure revulsion. "What are you doing here?" she hissed, her voice sharp like the crack of a whip. "Please, kind lady," Godwin rasped, his voice hoarse from the cold. "I am but a poor beggar, weary and hungry. If you have any food to spare, even a piece of bread, I would be forever grateful," she scoffed, stepping back in disgust. "How did you even get into our compound?" He lowered his head humbly. "I meant no harm, my lady. The rain is heavy, and Before he could finish, she did something that stunned him to his very core. She spat at him. The warm, wet glob landed just inches from his foot. "Get out of here," she barked, "before I call my father. How dare you bring your filthy presence to our home?" Godwin's breath caught in his throat. His heart twisted painfully. This was a woman he had once admired, a woman who had smiled sweetly at him in the palace, her eyes filled with what he had thought was affection. But now, in his moment of need, she had treated him no better than dirt beneath her feet. He bowed his head, taking a step back, ready to leave. But before he could turn away, the door creaked open again. Another girl stepped out. She was not as striking as the first, nor did she have the same proud, regal air about her. She was simple, her dress modest, her face softer, kinder. And in her hands, she held a plate of food. "Take this," she whispered urgently, thrusting the plate toward him. "Eat quickly and leave before anyone sees you." Godwin hesitated, staring at her in shock. This was unexpected, but before he could even take the plate, the first girl whirled around in fury. Her eyes burned with rage as she advanced toward the second girl and, without warning, delivered a sharp slap across her face. The sound echoed in the rain-drenched night. "How dare you?" she shrieked. "Do you know how much a cup of rice costs in the market? And you're wasting food on a beggar." The second girl winced but did not step back. She merely touched her burning cheek and spoke in a quiet voice. "I gave him my own portion, not yours." That only made the first girl angrier. She turned toward the house and shouted, "Mother! Father, come and see what this wretched girl is doing." Almost instantly, the door burst open, and a man and woman rushed out. The moment they saw the second girl standing in the rain, holding the plate of food, their faces darkened. "What is the meaning of this?" the woman demanded. "She was feeding a beggar," the first girl sneered, "like she owns this house." Without asking a single question, the man lunged forward and struck the second girl across the face. "You ungrateful wretch," he roared. "Is this how you repay us for taking you in, by wasting our food on filth?" The girl stumbled, falling to her knees. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not cry out. She simply bowed her head. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I won't do it again." Godwin clenched his fists. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to intervene, to stop this cruelty. But he couldn't, not yet. His heart felt like it was being torn apart as he turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. By the time he reached the palace gates, his entire soul felt heavy with grief. He knocked hesitantly, The guards peered out, their expressions unreadable in the dim light of the torches. I am in need of food, he murmured. One of the guards glanced at him, then nodded. Wait here. Minutes later, the gate swung open. To his utter shock, he was not just given food, he was invited inside. There, in the warm glow of the palace courtyard, he saw her his mother, the queen. She stood there, her elegant robes untouched by the storm, watching him with an unreadable expression. At her side, a maid carried a tray laden with food. The queen studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. And then, as the maid handed him the plate, something flickered in her gaze. A knowing look, a look only a mother could give her child. Godwin could no longer hold it in. He laughed, a deep, rich sound that echoed through the palace courtyard. He spun in place, shaking his head in disbelief. His mother gasped. Then, realization dawned in her eyes. Godwin, she cried. She rushed forward and smacked his shoulder, half in anger, half in relief. What in the name of the heavens are you doing dressed like this? Godwin could only shake his head, a bitter smile on his lips. He had his answer now, and it broke his heart. The queen's hands trembled as they rested on Prince Godwin's shoulders. She peered into his eyes, searching for answers, her heart pounding in fear and confusion. What is the meaning of this? She whispered. Why are you dressed like this? Where have you been? Godwin exhaled sharply, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the night's events. His clothes were still soaked from the rain, and the mud from the streets clung to his skin. He could feel the eyes of the palace guards on him, the puzzled stares of the maids standing in the shadows. I had to know, he murmured. The queen's brows furrowed. Know what? He turned away, pacing the courtyard, his footsteps leaving wet prints on the polished stone floor. Mother, do you know how many women desire to be my wife? How many families would give anything to have their daughter as the next queen? The queen sighed and folded her arms. Of course I do. It is only natural. You are the crown prince. Godwin let out a humorless chuckle. Yes, that is exactly the problem. He turned back to her, his gaze dark and unreadable. I have been drowning in their admiration, but tonight, I saw the truth. The queen's expression softened. And what truth is that, my son? For a long moment, he said nothing. The night wind whispered between them, carrying with it the faint sound of thunder in the distance. Then, finally, he spoke. They do not love me, he said, his voice thick with emotion. They love the crown. The queen stiffened. Godwin, they smile at me, they flatter me, they bat their lashes in my direction, he continued, his tone laced with bitterness. But tonight, when I stood before them as a beggar, not a single one of them saw me as a person worthy of kindness. The queen's eyes widened. You went to them in disguise? He nodded. I went to their homes, one by one, begging for food, for shelter, anything to show me their hearts. He clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Do you know what they did, mother? The queen swallowed hard, a feeling of unease curling in her stomach. They spat at me, he whispered, his voice laced with hurt. Chased me away like an animal. Some swept my footprints from their doorsteps as if my very presence had tainted their homes. He let out a shaky breath. Even the one I thought I loved the most, she was the worst of them all. The queen's heart twisted at the pain in her son's voice. Oh, my dear boy. Godwin lifted his gaze to her, and for the first time that night, his eyes shone with inched tears. But there was one, he whispered. The queen's breath caught. One. Yes. He nodded slowly. She was not the one I expected. She was quiet, I noticed, but when she saw a man hungry and cold, she did not turn me away. The memory of that moment burned in his mind, the way she had stepped forward, defying the scorn of the other girl. The way her hands had trembled as she offered him food, knowing she could be punished for it. She gave me food, he murmured, and for that, she was beaten. The queen inhaled sharply. Beaten. Godwin clenched his jaw. Her so-called family turned on her. They called her a burden, a curse. They said she was ungrateful and evil, all because she showed kindness. His voice cracked. And I did nothing. I walked away while she was suffering. The queen stepped forward and cupped his face in her hands. You have done nothing wrong, my son, she said gently. You sought the truth, and you found it. That is never a crime. Godwin shook his head. But now I must make it right. The queen frowned. What do you mean? I must go back for her. The queen's breath hitched. Godwin, she does not belong in that house, he said firmly. She deserves more than a life of suffering. His voice softened. She deserves love. The queen searched his face, her own expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, she sighed. "Then go," she said. Godwin's eyes widened. You would allow it." A sad smile touched her lips. "My son, I have spent years watching noble families push their daughters in your direction. I have seen how they dress in fine silks, how they practice their curtsies, how they speak words of honey in your presence. But tonight, you have seen what I have always feared." She reached for his hand and squeezed it. "A queen must have more than beauty and grace. She must have kindness, strength, and a heart that does not change when power is stripped away." Godwin swallowed hard. "If you believe this girl has such a heart," the queen continued, "then bring her home." Terror stung the prince's eyes. He bowed his head. "Thank you, mother." The queen smiled, brushing a damp strand of hair from his forehead. "Go now, she has suffered enough." Godwin nodded. He did not waste another moment. As he turned and strode toward the stables, his heart pounded with purpose. This time, he would not go as a beggar. This time, he would go as the prince she deserved. The palace was unusually lively in the days that followed. The heavy rain from that fateful night had given way to clear skies, and with it came the return of the many noble families eager to present their daughters before the crown prince once again. The large golden gates of the palace were rarely still. They opened and closed as carriages arrived, bringing elegant young women dressed in their finest garments. They walked gracefully, their heads held high, their laughter soft and practiced. The palace halls were filled with the sweet scents of lavender and jasmine from their expensive perfumes, and the sounds of their delicate voices echoed against the marble walls. Prince Godwin welcomed each one, his face calm, his posture regal. To the outside world, he remained the same charming, courteous prince they all adored. He smiled politely, nodded at their well-rehearsed compliments, and listened as they spoke of how much they missed him. "You have not visited in a while, Your Highness," one of them, Beatrice, said with a playful pout. Her emerald green gown sparkled under the palace lights, her golden earrings swaying as she spoke. "I was beginning to think you had forgotten me." "Another," Charlotte added, tilting her head slightly. Her dark curls framed her face perfectly, her beauty undeniable. One by one, they came, each claiming they had treated him the best, that their hearts were pure, that they were the ones most deserving of his affection. And Godwin, ever the patient prince, listened to them all, nodding, smiling, letting them speak their carefully chosen words. But his mind was elsewhere. No matter how much he tried to focus on the conversations, his thoughts kept drifting back to that girl, the one who had given him food despite knowing it could bring her harm. He remembered the fear in her eyes as she handed him the plate, the way her hands trembled slightly. He remembered the sharp sound of the slap, the cruel words spoken to her, the way she had cried out in pain. His chest tightened at the memory. Where was she now? Had she been punished further after he left? Was she still crying herself to sleep at night? He wanted to see her again. But how? If he simply rode to her house and asked for her, it would cause an uproar. The family might take out their anger on her again. Worse still, they might hide her away, making it impossible for him to reach her. He needed a plan. As another noble girl spoke to him about how much she had missed him, he found himself nodding absently, his fingers drumming lightly against the polished armrest of his seat. His thoughts were moving too fast, his mind racing with possibilities. "Are you listening, Your Highness?" the girl, Margaret, asked with a small laugh, her dark eyes watching him closely. Godwin blinked, forcing himself to focus. "Of course," he lied smoothly, offering her a small smile. She seemed satisfied with the answer and continued speaking, but he barely heard her. His heart was restless, his mind preoccupied. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the palace walls, Godwin stood at his chamber's window, staring out at the city below. The lights from the homes flickered like stars, and the distant hum of the marketplace still echoed through the air. Somewhere out there, she was going about her evening, perhaps sitting quietly in a corner, nursing the bruises given to her for her kindness. He could not stand it any longer. He had to see her, but he could not go as the prince, not yet. If he wanted to get close to her, he had to be careful. A slow plan began to form in his mind, and for the first time in days, a small spark of hope flickered in his chest. Tomorrow, he would leave the palace once again, but this time, he would not be a beggar. This time, he would go as someone else entirely. The morning sun rose gently over the kingdom, casting golden streaks of light across the palace walls. Yet, inside the prince's chamber, there was no peace. Godwin stood by the tall window, his hands clasped behind his back, his heart heavy with worrying. He had barely slept the night before. The image of the girl's tear-streaked face haunted him. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the sharp sound of the slap, the cruel insults thrown at her. He could not bear it any longer. He needed to see her, but he knew that if he went himself, he would cause trouble. Her family might react differently if they saw the crown prince at their doorstep. It would draw attention, and he did not want that not yet. So he called for one of his trusted palace guards, Henry. Henry was tall, broad-shouldered, and loyal to the prince beyond measure. He had served in the palace for years, and Godwin trusted him completely. "You will go to the house," Godwin instructed, his voice calm but firm. "Ask for the girl who was punished that night, the one who gave food to the beggar." Henry frowned slightly. "Your Highness, what should I tell them?" Godwin hesitated for a moment. "Tell them only that the prince wants to see her." Henry bowed deeply. "As you wish, my prince." And with that, he left. The sun had fully risen by the time Henry arrived at the house. It was not as grand as the homes of noble families, but it was still a house of wealth. The walls were high, the doors polished, and the courtyard clean. He knocked loudly. Within seconds, the large wooden door swung open, and there she was, the beautiful one, the very girl Prince Godwin had once considered marrying. She stood in the doorway, dressed in a flowing blue gown, her long black hair carefully arranged, her face glowing with expectation. When she saw the royal guard, her lips curled into a delighted smile. "The prince sent for me?" she asked, already straightening her posture, adjusting her jewelry. Henry looked at her for a moment, then shook his head. "No, my lady, I was sent to find the other girl." The smile froze on her face. For a second, she did not react. Then she blinked. "The other girl?" "Yes," Henry confirmed, her brows furrowed, confusion flickering in her eyes. Slowly, she turned her head and called over her shoulder, "Mother." From inside the house, heavy footsteps approached, and soon the mother appeared, her eyes gleaming with curiosity. She wiped her hands on her wrapper, looking from her daughter to the royal guard. "What is it?" she asked. "Mother," the beautiful one said slowly, her voice unsure, "the royal guard is looking for her." The mother's smile faded instantly. She stared at Henry, then narrowed her eyes. "Why?" Henry shook his head. "I do not know, my lady. All I know is that the prince wishes to see her." A cold silence fell over them. Then, the mother's face twisted in anger. "What has she done?" she snapped, her voice sharp. "Why would the prince send for her? What kind of trouble has she caused?" Henry remained silent. He had been ordered to say no more. The mother turned, her gaze burning with fury as she stormed into the house. "Come out here," she shouted. A few seconds passed, and then the girl emerged slowly from the shadows of the house. She was dressed in an old brown gown, her feet bare, her arms covered in faint bruises from the previous night's punishment. Her eyes were downcast, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if she had already accepted whatever fate was waiting for her. When she reached the doorway, she stopped, her hands clasped in front of her, her head bowed. The mother took one look at her and raised her hand. Slap! The force of it made the girl stumble. "What have you done?" the mother hissed, grabbing her arm. "What did you do to make the prince send for you?" "I don't know," the girl stammered, wincing at the pain. The mother slapped her again. "Liar, you must have done something. Do you think princes look for useless girls like you?" The girl bit her lip, fighting back tears. "I swear, I don't know." But the mother was not listening. She pushed the girl backward, pointing a trembling finger at her. "You are a curse, nothing but bad luck. First, you killed your parents, and now you want to bring shame upon this house." The words stung more than the slaps. The girl clenched her fists, her chest tightening, but she did not argue. She had learned long ago that no amount of protest would change what they believed about her. Henry, who had been watching in silence, finally stepped forward. "My lady," he said firmly, "the prince is waiting. We must go." The mother huffed, crossing her arms. "Take her and go. I don't care what happens to her. She is no daughter of mine." The girl swallowed hard. She did not cry. She simply turned and followed Henry, her steps slow, her heart pounding. As they stepped out onto the street, she finally dared to glance at the royal guard. "Is the prince angry?" she asked quietly. Henry looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You will find out soon enough," he said. And with that, they walked toward the palace. The palace was a place of grandeur and beauty. Its towering walls gleamed under the afternoon sun, and the scent of freshly bloomed roses drifted through the air. Birds chirped softly in the vast gardens, where a majestic fountain stood in the middle, water cascading down its marble structure. But as the girl stepped inside, she did not see the beauty. Her legs trembled, her lips quivered. She felt like a prisoner walking into the unknown, not knowing whether she would be punished or cast out. Her heartbeat pounded against her chest as she followed the royal guard. The palace was too vast, too beautiful, too much. She had never set foot inside such a place, and every step she took felt heavier than the last. Finally, they arrived at the royal garden, and there, sitting under a golden pavilion surrounded by lush green trees, was the prince, Prince Godwin. The sight of him made her knees weak. She had seen him before, of course. The whole kingdom had. He was the desire of every maiden, the dream of every noble family. His beauty was almost unreal, tall, broad-shouldered, his golden brown skin glowing in the sunlight, his dark, intelligent eyes piercing through the air. And now, he was looking straight at her. The moment their eyes met, something flickered across the prince's face. He stood up immediately. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and warm. The girl did not move. She could not. She felt as if her feet had been nailed to the ground. She had never been this close to him before. Never imagined she would be standing before the prince, much less that he would be welcoming her. The prince noticed her hesitation and smiled gently. "Please, don't be afraid. Come." The girl swallowed hard. She hesitated. Then, with slow, shaky steps, she walked toward him. The closer she got, the dizzier she felt. The prince pulled out a chair for her to sit, but she remained standing, her hands clenched together, her head bowed. She was afraid. Afraid to sit. Afraid to talk. Afraid to even breathe too loudly. The prince noticed. His gaze softened. "You don't have to be afraid," he said. "I'm not going to hurt you." She nodded but still didn't sit. The prince sighed, then motioned to the servants. At once, a table was set before them, covered in the finest dishes. Golden goblets of fresh fruit juice, steaming plates of food, bowls of fruits, and delicate pastries. The girl's stomach clenched. Was she really supposed to eat? Was this a test? Was this some kind of trick? She had spent most of her life eating scraps, sitting on the kitchen floor of her aunt's house while they dined at the main table. Now, she was being served a meal fit for royalty, and she was expected to eat it. Her hands trembled as she stared at the plate. The prince, noticing her discomfort, picked up his own cup of juice and drank. Then he took his fork and took a bite of the food. "Eat," he urged gently. The girl hesitated. She glanced at the palace guards standing in the distance, their faces expressionless. She glanced at the servants moving quietly around. Was she really allowed to do this? She finally picked up a spoon, her fingers shaking. She took a small bite, so small it barely counted as food. The prince chuckled. "You can eat properly," he said, watching her with amusement. "No one is going to stop you." She took another bite, then another. The taste burst in her mouth, rich and flavorful, unlike anything she had ever eaten before. The food was soft, warm, comforting. For the first time in a long time, she felt human, not like a burden, not like an outcast, just human. The prince watched her closely, a thoughtful expression on his face. When they finished eating, he leaned back in his chair and asked, "Tell me about yourself." The girl froze. She had never been asked that before. No one had ever cared enough to ask. She swallowed, setting her spoon down. "There's not much to say," she murmured. The prince's gaze remained steady. "Tell me anyway." She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "My parents died in a motor accident," she said softly. "Years ago." The prince's expression did not change, but she saw the flicker of emotion in his eyes. "I was inside the car with them," she continued. Her voice wavered slightly, but she kept going. "I was the only one who survived." Silence. She looked down, twisting her fingers together. "Since then," she whispered, "they call me a witch." The words hung heavily in the air. The prince frowned. "Who calls you that?" "The people in my house," she swallowed. "The people in my father's house. My aunt, her family, they say that I am cursed. That it should have been me who died." The prince's hands curled into fists. He had suspected that she was being mistreated. But to hear it so plainly, to hear the pain in her voice, it made his heart ache in a way he did not understand. He exhaled heavily, leaning forward. "The woman you live with," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "She is your father's sister." The girl nodded. "She took me in after my parents died. But," she hesitated, looking away, "but she treats me like a maid. I wash their clothes, scrub the floors, and cook their food. I don't even remember the last time I was given new clothes." The prince said nothing for a long time. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair. His mind was racing. This girl, the one who had given a beggar food despite having so little herself. The one who had been beaten, insulted, and cast aside. She had suffered so much, and yet, she had not lost her kindness. He looked at her, really looked at her. Her hands were rough, bearing the signs of endless labor. Her skin, though beautiful, carried faint scars that spoke of struggle. She was not like the other girls who had come to the palace, full of pride and expectation. She was different. The prince exhaled deeply, rubbing his temple. "Everything will be fine," he said at last. The girl blinked at him, confusion flickering in her eyes. The prince did not explain. He did not say anything else. But deep inside, he knew. Things would not remain the same. Not for her. Not for him. Not for anyone. The sun had begun to set by the time she returned home. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, casting a golden glow over the small compound. But despite the beauty of the evening, there was nothing warm about the place she called home. The moment she stepped through the gate, her aunt's sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "You are finally back." The girl paused, her hands tightening into fists. She had expected this. She had known that coming back would mean facing their wrath. But still, she had no choice. She had nowhere else to go. Her aunt stormed toward her, eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Why did the prince send for you?" The beautiful girl, her cousin, stood by the doorway with her arms folded across her chest, her flawless face twisted in a scowl. "What did you do? Why would the prince want to see you?" The girl hesitated, then took a deep breath. He did not send for me to punish me." Her aunt's face darkened. The girl continued, her voice quiet but steady. "He only wanted to ask about my parents." Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then, a loud cry pierced the air. It came from her cousin. She clutched her chest as if in pain, her beautiful face twisted in anguish. "No," she shrieked. "You're lying. You must have bewitched him. The prince is for me." The girl blinked in shock. Her cousin's face was contorted with rage, her perfect lips trembling as tears welled in her eyes. She looked genuinely hurt. The aunt, seeing her daughter's reaction, suddenly burst into laughter. A cruel, mocking laughter. She placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder and shook her head. "Calm down, my child," she said, amusement dripping from her tone. "You don't have to cry over this nonsense." The girl looked up, confused. Her aunt turned to her with a smirk, her voice filled with condescension. "There is no human being, no sane man, who would ever choose an ugly girl in rags over a beautiful girl like my daughter." She turned back to her daughter and wiped her tears dramatically. "Do you think the prince is blind? Do you think he does not see how beautiful you are?" Her daughter sniffled, hope flickering in her teary eyes. Her mother nodded firmly. "The prince is yours," she said with certainty. "This wretched girl is nothing. She is nothing but bad luck." The beautiful girl straightened, her confidence returning. She sniffed one last time before flipping her hair over her shoulder. "That's true," she muttered, glaring at her cousin. "There's no way the prince would ever choose her." The girl stood frozen, listening to them as they spoke about her as if she was not there, as if she was invisible, as if her existence meant nothing. Her heart ached, but she was not surprised. It had always been this way. She had always been nothing to them. She lowered her head. "I should go inside," she murmured. Her aunt scoffed. "Yes, go. You've wasted enough of our time." The beautiful girl folded her arms and smirked. "And don't you dare go near the palace again. I don't know what trick you pulled today, but it won't work a second time." The girl said nothing. She stood there. She knew that a prince would never choose her as a wife. Hello champions, I hope you enjoyed our stories. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.